appreciate everyone's time today. We're very excited to have a panel, and we've got some interesting folks on the panel for you. We want to talk about maximizing market share. So my background is I'm the president of Salesforce for Hire. We're in the custom sales and prototyping business for companies. So we bring companies to market, whether it be older companies or newer companies, usually publicly traded 100-year-old are companies we deal with. But I'm very excited to be on a panel with a couple of folks that have some great background. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, give you a little bit of their background, and then we're going to talk about a couple trends and share some trends with you. And then we're going to cover some questions around those trends. So if I could, with that, I want to start left to right. From my left, Peter Arduini of Integra LifeSciences.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of Integra LifeSciences. It'll be 3 years in January. Prior to that, I was with Baxter Healthcare for a few years, and prior to that, quite a bit of time with GE Healthcare, for about 25 years within the broader healthcare space.
And my next gentleman I'd like to introduce is Tom Cafford, is the CEO and President of Beaver Visitex. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm, for the past 4 years, have been with Beaver Visitech, which is an ophthalmic surgical device company specific in ophthalmology, owned by Roundtable Healthcare Partners. Prior to that, I spent 24 years at Cardinal Health, Baxter, Allegiance Healthcare, all the different predecessor companies, so 28 years in healthcare, the past 4 years with BVI.
And our last but not least is Walt Rosebrough. I'm very fortunate to have Walt on the panel. I actually have experience back with STERIS and very grateful for my time there. So, Walt?
Walt Rosebrough, I'm the CEO of STERIS. I've been at STERIS 7 years. I've been in the industry since 1982. CEO of a company called SSI, which was a wound care service and equipment business, a company called Hillrom, which across the board patient room equipment device company, and then STERIS. We sterilize for the medical device industry, so most of you have sterile products or components, use us probably to sterilize them. For the pharmaceutical industry, to clean and sterilize, disinfect their plants. And for hospitals, we also do all kinds of sterilization equipment, products, services, as well as operating room infrastructure like tables, lights, those types of equipment.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends going on. And one of the trends we're seeing is the buying decision, or the authority of the buying decision, moving from a department or a specific user to more of a management or financial decision versus a technical basis. So I was wondering if you could share some insights on that. Specifically, how are companies responding to the shift from their buyer being the technical person to more of a financial purchasing type person? So I'll just kind of go left to right, or?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say, people are talking about this a lot, like this is a new trend. This is not a new trend. This is a new trend that's been going on since about 1977, 78. The guys in the, I'll call it the typical supplies side of the business, these guys know a lot better than I do. They went through this with the early part of the group purchasing in the 70s. More on my side of the business, on the capital equipment side, we probably started going through that in the 80s. And so, and it's true, it waxes and wanes as the strength of the buying groups and the IDNs and various organizations come, but it is clearly a trend, and it hits different parts of the industry at different times. So I think a lot of the focus today is on what people would historically call the physician preference items, and now there is that movement going on in those items, much like there has been in the rest of the industry for maybe 20, 25 years.
Right. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I would just add, it has changed radically even over the past 10 to 15 years. Cost containment is critical, so as a manufacturer, first and foremost, we look at what we can do to control our costs. We know we're not going to gain market share if we can't be cost competitive in the industry. We also look at differentiation and intellectual property and looking at different ways to bring unique products to market that somewhat are still physician preference, and in the case of my company, surgeon preference is critical. You can play the cost game only so long. There's only so much you can do to rationalize your sales force or look to source to third parties that maybe can do it less expensively for more mature commoditized products. But we really focus on innovation and differentiation to try to continue to bring to the market and to surgeons what they need to continue to care for patients, certainly in a less expensive, but hopefully a better way that improves the outcomes as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, what I would just add, Kevin, is the fact that, what I would add is the fact that, just to complement what the guys said, all those trends are in play, but clearly since the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has been in motion, there's been an acceleration of a lot of these trends. Obviously, all of us have been dealing with at some level to prove out that your products have clinical evidence. That's increasing more and more, and clearly the health economics components of does it really make a fundamental difference? We're starting to see more, obviously, groups such as value committees and things of that nature that are really wanting to see when you bring a new product in, does it reduce length of stay? Does it reduce cost? Does it reduce infections, things of that nature? So they've all been out there, but now you're starting to see, I think, more and more integrated delivery systems push that, request that. And I think, some of the trends in our world in particular, and I know others, more calls on the administrative standpoint. I think Walt's business, you guys have done that many, many cases for many years. For some of us that have been more physician preference, it's now a balancing act between the two. And I don't think it's switched from one to the other. Now you're working both, and in many cases, your cost of sales is higher. But over time, I think there is definitely more of a switch to executive or administrative decisions playing a bigger part in the process.
And I would add,
please do.
I would add, Peter, I agree with you completely, and I would add that the physician and or the nurse, the clinical user or the decision maker of those clinical users is not going to be left out of the decision. There will be some times they are, that'll be a mistake and they'll correct, just like in our manufacturing plants. If we leave the engineering guys out, materials management makes the decision without them, that's a mistake and we correct. So it will happen occasionally, but that won't be the rule. Having said that, one individual physician, one individual nurse is not going to be allowed to make as many decisions as they were in the past. I think that's the biggest difference. And so the key is to be able to demonstrate to groups of people, which is a cross-functional group, what your products do and do not do, as you said.
Well, I was going to actually ask that. So you touched on a couple things. So the first one I go back to is kind of standardization that's going on in the marketplace. So we're talking about capturing market share. Can you share some insight of what someone might do to try to leverage that in the marketplace? So think about how standardization, the physicians aren't being able to do as much as they could, so the physician preference, while still there, is somewhat limited, but perhaps you can shed some insight on how a company might go about trying to leverage that to capture some market share.
Well, I can start.
It wasn't a good question.
Great question, just a hard question.
Yeah. I'm not going to let you go on the easy ones. So.
Yeah, thanks, I appreciate that. Speed within the operating room is really becoming a critical factor. Absolutely. So as we're seeing more and more standardization of products within the operating room, it's not just the cost of the device itself, but it's can the device turn the OR quicker? Can you allow that surgeon and that clinical team to perform more surgeries to better utilize that fixed asset? And turnover, we've learned, has become critical. And we're talking minutes, as well as seconds in some cases. So not only for the benefit of the surgery center or the hospital, but also that surgeon, that the more procedures they do, the more income they can generate for themselves. So we focused, as we look toward more commoditized products within our portfolio, can these products help the hospital or surgery center be more efficient, to become more productive and focus more on the revenue side, try to get away from cost containment, more toward revenue generation for the institution?
I would add that one of the things that we're seeing as well is that just more systems focus, and I would say health systems. So health systems making more decisions at an integrated decision, but clinical systems. So obviously some of the acquisition was just announced this week, is focused on about creating broader systems that are going to help with pharmacy systems and things. People focused on broader systems to reduce infection, or integrated structures across cardiovascular lines, or in our case, looking at wound care or neurosurgery. And I think one of the things we're starting to see more, Kevin, as well, is even if you're a smaller company and don't have all of those products to think across that area, partnering with others or looking at ways to find more integrated solutions to either drive better outcomes or reduce cost is something that's clearly in the air.
So another kind of term that's out there is acceptable for use, and what's happening is the hospitals are putting committees together. Again, to your point, Walt, this is not necessarily new, it's just people tend to think it's new, so you actually have to do your sales process, so to speak. But I guess my question would be to help some of the companies out there, how do they go about driving or taking advantage of some of that, or is there any insights you could share on how to leverage better preparing your company to deal with that type of an issue? So again, acceptability of use,
sure,
if you will.
I'll take a shot at it. First of all, I've not met a materials manager in a hospital or in my company who doesn't think that everything's acceptable for use, right? I mean, that is their job, or at least says that it's acceptable. It's their job to say it's acceptable for use, to create the kind of incentive that we have to get the business, if you will. So, first, it's absolutely a good negotiating tactic on the part of materials managers. It's also a truism, right? If there are 2 or 3 products that are acceptable across the entire system, then those 2 or 3 products are put against each other to work it out. In my view, and this has already been said, you really have 2 issues. One issue is to create products that are indeed acceptable, but then are somewhat better for one reason or another. And, we're working on cost, on lowering energy costs, on lowering water costs, things like that. So yes, we're acceptable for this use, but we're also better for this and that and the other reason. So differentiation is the key to that question. And then within that, you just have to be able to tell your story to a broader audience. It used to be Bill or Sally or Jim could make the decision. Today, you're going to have 4 or 5 people, probably a finance person, probably a materials manager in that process. And so you have to be able to communicate with that group. In a past life, I had a situation where we went from what I call a complete clinical sale to a complete sale, more like what we're describing. There were basically 2 significant competitors in the industry. One of them was much more the old American Hospital Supply, Allegiance type of sales force. Ours was very clinical. What ended up happening is we met in the middle. We trained our people to be more like American Hospital Supply salespeople. They trained their people to be more clinical. In the end, we met in the middle because when you're working with a group, you have to be able to put the clinical goods on the table. Right. But at the same time, you have to be able to talk to people about efficiency and effectiveness and cost. And so I think you'll see more of that movement to the middle where you have people, either groups, teams of people, a clinical person and a person who has the business side, or people that can do both. I think we'll see much more of that. We have it across the industry, but I think you'll see even more of that.
Yeah, one of the things we're seeing a lot of is actually where companies are spending more time where traditionally you do training of a sales organization would be a clinical and then a time and territory management. Now they're actually spending time in the finance side so that your salesperson can have a good conversation with the financial person, and actually sales reps that can read a P&L and a balance sheet, which is something they're totally foreign to. They realize that the hospital has to understand the cost. So to your point, absolutely. Another interesting thing that's coming is the systems are merging. So we're seeing larger systems that are continuing to accelerate and grab all the physicians' offices. So one of the things I'd like to chat with you a little bit about is that physician's office is starting to become a mechanism or a feeding system for the hospital. So they're getting basically the footprint. How do you suggest some of the companies look at possibly going and get, again, after market share, how can they march into that environment, and any suggestions you have to go after that dynamic of changing?
Well, I can start. One key to that new change in the model is what you said, and that is the physician. And that physician is now joining that practice and wants to have a say in the decision of what products they use. And if it's from their office to an ambulatory setting to the acute care setting, they would prefer to have the same product across all points of care. It's easier to have better outcomes when you're not dealing with a variety of product. So although we're a small organization, globally we only have 80 sales representatives, 25 here in the States. We try to, as much as possible, call on that physician, call on that surgeon to try to influence their behavior relative to the differentiated products that we're bringing to market. But I think it gets back to what Walt was saying around differentiation. If you can't differentiate your product, it very easily can become commoditized, and then it becomes that price game. But I think selling across that continuum and going to the person that actually uses the product, I think can be the key to success for many companies, especially smaller companies that maybe can't access the C-suite at large IDNs.
Yeah, I would just add that obviously the trend is growing, more physicians becoming employees. It varies by discipline, but as we're all employees to a company, as opposed to individual decisions, you have more and more goals that are aligned to doing things that are aligned with the company vision. And in many cases, I think there's some negatives in some cases for more marketing. There's some positives. The positives obviously are, as more of those folks become part of that IDN, and to our previous question, if you crack some of these value committees and you get your productable as an acceptable one that's on, there's a higher propensity that those folks are going to use it to accept the procedures within the institution. The other side, though, is if you have a highly physician select product and you can't really get the differentiation, it does become tougher. And I think it is clearly moving in that mode of making some decisions about the products that you're really going to differentiate and promote that way, and other products that you're going to bring in more of maybe a Me Too matter. But again, I think in a lot of these cases, clinical data at a clinician level, as well as the right economic data at executive level, those two are converging every day. And I think most of the health systems are at different varying of levels of integration around those decisions.
One of the things that's also coming up, so you have all these trends going on and you're trying to maximize your share, but how is this changing the competitive landscape? And again, obviously we don't want to necessarily talk negatively about a competitor, but just understanding how it's changing the way you're going about dealing in that forum. So if you could shed some light on that. No one volunteering.
I don't think, I don't know that it's changed the competitive landscape that much. I think obviously what you're seeing is consolidation. So if you look at it that way, you're clearly seeing people consolidating, right. A, to drive down our costs, and B, to give broader coverage. So some of these system things that Peter's talked about. So if you can see a system where you can capture a bigger piece of the system, therefore do better R&D, better service around that, and capture it, clearly that's something that almost everybody in the industry is looking at, particularly the larger companies. And so that's clearly happening. But in the end, it's kind of interesting because most customers, most of the time, are working to disaggregate to buy, right? A materials manager is hardly ever looking to aggregate up when they do an RFP. So there's this constant workings of people aggregating, the customers disaggregating, the customers deciding one versus another. In some sense, it balances out in a way, right? Obviously, if you have IDNs, if you have a bigger loss, it's a bigger loss. But if you have a win, it's a bigger win. And so to some extent, it balances out over time, in my opinion. But I think it would really change if we start seeing what I'll call broad national chains, to where there were 5 hospital chains nationwide. That really changes the dynamic. I think a lot of the dynamic now is still very similar. It's just bigger pockets to win and lose in. I do think for smaller companies, back to Pete's point, you really have to innovate because you're not going to have the breadth. So you have to have the innovation, or you have to have a system around a small problem to fix that. So for smaller companies, which has always been, innovation's always been the heartbeat of smaller companies, it's even a more important heartbeat, I think, today than it was.
Yeah, I would just add that this question of scale and relevance is a big question. Yes. To change Walt's words somewhat, the point about relevance, if you're a small player, yeah, you have to be very innovative, but you have to be relevant. And how you define that space you're in, you could be highly relevant if it's in ophthalmology or where it might be in certain disease states. But clearly there's a trend of scale. It's hard to pick up the paper in our market and not see scale happening. And the assumptions on scale are better cost efficiencies, mainly because of obviously the increased regulatory burden, the increased cost to actually be in this industry. And then the opportunity potentially down the road for scale to matter, and scale to matter from an aggregated purchase standpoint. I would agree with Walt that it isn't here today, but it potentially could be someday down the road. And I think there's a lot of obviously strategies in place that are touching on many of those different points.
So I want to shift a little bit. So we've been talking about growing market share. I guess one of the things that's come up commonplace now is how do companies like some of yours take some of their their legacy product lines and breathe new life into them? So maybe you could share some insight into that, because a lot of times with companies that are out on the front end, they actually will look at it and think of how you did bringing life back to an older one, and they'll enjoy that. So perhaps you could share some insight into that.
Well, we have our company has 80 years of history behind it. So not that we have products that are 80 years old, but some are 50 years old, literally. And talk about a challenge to breathe new life into those types of products. But quality and consistency and reliability and brand is really important, and we certainly try to play off of that. But we've also looked at other go-to-market models. We've looked at e-commerce, we've looked at inside sales organizations that can take those more mature products. We've looked at third-party outsourcing of companies similar to yourself, Kevin, that do this for a living and have the ability to breathe fresh life into the product so that our smaller team can focus on those newer, innovative products. I'd also say, having grown up in the legacy of the larger companies that sold off of reputation and relationships, relationships are less important today. in the grand scheme of things. Building relationships at the C-suite and at the IDN level is important, but you know, in front of that decision maker, that end user, it's more about the product and it's more about, you know, what the corporation says needs to happen. So I think that opens up doors for smaller companies that maybe have always had better products but couldn't crack through that relationship challenge from those organizations that had the scale and the market share of the past.
Yeah, good point.
You know, we have our primary product that's 100 some odd years old is steam sterilizers. And so a steam sterilizer, you know, is a steam sterilizer, right? You pour steam in, you put something in, and you sterilize it. But those products have changed remarkably over the last 10 years. And we're using, you know, 1/20th of the water. We're using 1/10 of the energy. We're doing a lot of things to get on what hospitals care about, right? They didn't care about water 20 years ago. Today, and particularly in some areas, you get out west, they care more about water than they do about many other things. And so these kinds of issues, you have to get on their bandwagon, if you will, what it is that is meaningful to them and move the product accordingly. So that would be a classic example, I would say. I do want to make one more pitch for AdvaMed while I'm up here, particularly for small companies. And this is going to be a change. We have started working with the voluntary purchasing groups in working on making the AdvaMed code our approach to the way we sell and to making that a true industry standard. It's clearly a standard and it's in AdvaMed. All the board members have signed up to that code. But I think you will be seeing, you've seen Novation beginning to come on board with that. You've seen Premier coming on board with that. Intermountain Hospital is actually putting it into their request for proposals. So I think we will begin seeing people looking at the sales process as a disciplined, ethical process. Not that it hasn't been, but that, you know, we get everybody on the same playing field. So I would, if I were a smaller business, I would start looking at that today so we comply tomorrow.
I'm really excited to hear you say it, because we actually, as a company, we've been involved with AdvaMed for several years, but we actually take the code of conduct, and that's an exhibit in every contract in our business. So we would absolutely adhere to that and found that very valuable. So thank you for bringing that up. And I agree, AdvaMed's done some wonderful things of setting the pace in some of those things. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the new product launches and how companies might ensure the right strategy when they're launching a model before they get too far into it. So perhaps you could share a little bit of how you decide, okay, I've got a product, I'm going to bring it to market. What are the things you're going to do before you actually, let's say, remove another product or legacy product from your core team and shift this new product in?
I'll take a shot at it. I mean, we've spent a good chunk of time at Integra in the last few years kind of building out our, let's just say, ideation process. We have a process where we look at, candidly, product roadmaps for products around the world. And one of our big priorities is we've done a great job of making products for the United States. How do those match up for our other markets around the world? And some of that is getting the right structures in place early enough and funding some pre-marketing work to actually get enough research done from the different constituents. So you just heard, you know, from a lot of the discussion that it's not just the clinical decision maker anymore, it's many of the economic, that we'll spend time on certain programs up front before we'll ever agree on a, you know, pre-P1 milestone or to fund a program to show that it has those economic value. And so I think for all of us, we've done clinical studies, clinical pieces of work, but it's not necessarily natural for us, particularly in MedTech. It is more in pharma to spend more time almost bringing a group together that acts like a value committee for you from different institutions or stuff to actually help you look at the products you're working on or that particular product to see if you can build out the economic value. Because, you know, my view would be, even if you're going to get good clinical results, but you can't show the economic value of how it's going to pay out in China or in the United States, you shouldn't do the program. And I would say 3 years ago, we never did that. And that's kind of a new step and a new piece that we're really adding in is, can we actually have this product pay for itself that way?
Any other comments? Well, thank you. We have about a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you one more question and certainly give you a chance to chat about anything you like. But I guess what other factors that you just shared, and Pete shared a lot of information, but I guess what the question would be is, what are the items that actually shut down you taking a product to market? So what's the stop? Is there any indicators you find that immediately cause you to tap on the brakes?
No sales is usually a big one.
Yeah. Seems to cure every issue.
I mean, generally speaking, when we start a product, we have a process where we say it's going to meet a certain set of criteria. You know, its cost, its potential revenue, how it's going to perform in certain methods. And, you know, we always start out with, you know, very nice objectives. Well, not perfect, but we start out with very nice objectives. And usually, you know, if there's 6 objectives, you might hit 5 of the 6. And if that's good enough for the marketplace, that's fine. If that's not good enough for the marketplace, it either gets redone. We have, we have it kind of an emergency stop and then try to fix it. And if we can't fix it, it dies. And so it just depends. There's no universal, I would say, group of things, but the kind of things we've been talking about here. You're doing something different clinically. Are you doing something that you can show the economic value? What about this is different from our 5 previous products and our competitors' 5 products? And if we don't hit those milestones, it's got to die because it's not going to live in the marketplace.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, just the point, you definitely have to be clear about what's going to make a difference. And so, we all live through the windows at times. If you build it and a little bit better, you're going to always get some sales out of it. Right. I think a lot of those days are gone to the wayside. So understanding what the metrics of success are and actually doing enough small experiments, again, in a little bit taking the biotech model that you may start 4 or 5 proofs of concept at low dollars. Half of those, 3/4 of those may fail. The ones that work, take them to the next level. And particularly in cases like, I would just use an example in our wound care business where you're dealing with matrices that are biologic-based products, devices, being able to understand that scale up before you get deep into it, because deep into it isn't even necessarily the cost of the product. Deep into it is the manufacturing scale up of a $50 million facility you may need to make this successful. So it's the convergence of a lot of those things.
Is there any metric you can think of that's one critical measure? Like in other words, when I think of a sales process or something like that, in my world, we start to identify how long the sales cycle is, what are the key characters, personnel. I'm just trying to think of anything specifically that, okay, outside of, you don't hit a revenue number, is there something coming through your process?
Well, I mean, look, there's 2 simple ones, which is, of all the predicate devices that are out there, does this beat it clinically?
Yeah. Right.
Can you show that this heals faster, closes faster, does this faster? So that's one.
Yep.
Obviously, the second one, and if you get both, you've got the home run, which is it cheaper to actually implement than any of the other out there? So if you got the best clinically and you got the best cost, that's it. So the question always is, you never have usually both. It's how close are you and how well can you justify that? Excellent.
Well, any other comments? Well, I guess that's pretty much it for our panel. I just want to thank Walt, Tom, and Pete as well, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you.